Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Jesvir Kaur Mahil, and in this session I am going to be explaining the way I do research using a combination of autoethnography, public engagement and self-publishing. This is the approach that I have used to write my books based on this particular combination of autoethnography, public engagement and self-publishing. And I will use as an example, as a basis, the book that I've recently completed called Learn to Lead Using Story Synthesis and Questions, which was entirely based on an autoethnographic approach, engaged in public engagement, and also a combination of the self-publishing. And I will explain later why the self-publishing aspect is really important in this approach. So with the APS, the autoethnography, public engagement and self-publishing, I use various perspectives. The first person perspective based on my own lived experience, the public engagement aspect, which is interactional, the discourses, the conversations, the dialogue, the narratives that I engage in with others. So that's the we perspective. And the self-publishing is the third person perspective. What are others saying about this theme, this subject, and what is accepted wisdom, accepted knowledge, and how does what I'm saying contribute? How does what I'm saying add value to what already exists? So that's the third dimension, the more impartial, objective aspect of the research. When we do research, we need to make sure that we can rationalize our approach, make sure that our approach is systematic, that it's logical, that it's transparent, it's very clear to others exactly what you have done and how you have drawn your conclusions and come to your findings, and make sure that the process is ethical in terms of doing no harm, that the research doesn't do any harm while you are doing the research or as a consequence of doing the research. So that's a very fundamental consideration to take, that to ensure that you are minimizing the risks that may arise as a result of you doing this research. But in my view, we do research informally from childhood, because as children we make observations or we're curious about something, we realize we don't know the answer to something, and when we make these observations we notice that there is something that we don't know, and we feel that it's important for us to know. We ask questions, we make hypotheses, we make assumptions about things, and then the methodology is simply, how do we find out the answers to our questions? How do we test out our assumptions? We might use, as children, we might use the methodology of asking questions to our family, our friends, peers, teachers. As adults, we may ask those questions to our colleagues, again, to our peers, to our managers. So our methodology in terms of finding out the answers to the questions that we have, the questions that we're curious about. We might read books about it. We might watch webinars, podcasts. Then we might go to the library and do some informal research about it. But we have methods, regardless of whether these are formal methods or not. But we have methods, we have strategies to find out how to solve those questions that we want to find answers to. And we might collect data. We might have a research project, and there might be numerous ways that we collect the data about it. The data could be written text that we find in books. It could be multimedia information that we have, programs that we've watched on TV, documentaries. It could be photographs, it could be other visual data. So there's a whole array of data sources that we could use in order to answer those questions, and then we have to analyze that. And I suppose this is at this stage that it can become more formal, because in an informal sense, we may simply collect the data and jump to conclusions without really analyzing the findings. We may go from stage 2, where we have some questions and we draw some conclusions without testing out our assumptions. And so this is why the methodology has to be logical, it has to be systematic, and we need to be transparent about our findings and how our conclusions derive from our findings. And the recommendations we make, they can't simply be recommendations based on anecdotal evidence that we may have interpreted in a particular way based on our lived experience, but somebody else may interpret those same examples, those same stories in a very different way, and they would come up with very different recommendations. So therefore, the fact that it's systematic, that it's logical, it's transparent, means that we're able to disseminate the knowledge in a manner that it can be tried and tested by others. So this is what makes the process scientific, regardless of whether we are engaged in research informally or formally. So when we make observations, regardless of how we are doing the research, these observations lead to some sort of curiosity. We identify a need, there's a problem that we want to solve. And as adults, this can be a combination of both internal and external drivers that are motivating us to identify what the problem is, and the fact that there is value in solving the problem. And based on these drivers, there has to be initially that driver, that motivation that gives us the incentive to spend our time and energy in following up on these observations. And we formulate some questions and we draw some hypotheses. We think, well, maybe it's this and maybe it's that. And so these are hypotheses that we then need to devise a methodology to find the answers to. And so our methodology is basically how will we find the answers to these questions, solutions to these problems. And, you know, in my research, my main concern is always to elicit insights. So I'm curious about something, and my methodology is all about, let's see what we can uncover with this curiosity. What insights can we gain in exploring this? And then we can collect data, and that data can be stories. We can read stories, we can listen to stories, we can construct stories, and or we can establish facts about something and opinions, or we may be more interested in getting the data used in a statistical way. But regardless of what data we collect, whether it's visual, whether it's written, whether it's electronic, we need to analyze that data and identify some themes or patterns or trends or correlations. We need to churn that data in some way that it makes the meaning, you know, from the superficial level, from the raw data, which is the data is there for us to do something with. And initially we might simply be connecting the dots between the data, and through connecting the dots, that's how we identify the patterns. And it's by connecting the dots that we can see some trends, we can see some associations, some correlations. And so from that analysis, we find things out, we find insights, we might learn from making these connections and identifying what these patterns are. And then we can draw conclusions. The conclusions are usually a synthesis. First, we've analyzed the data, and then we've put it together, we've reconstructed it and drawn some conclusions. And based on these conclusions, we can make some recommendations based on the insights that we've uncovered. And these recommendations, ideally, they would be recommendations that are valuable and they influence and they make a significant impact that is tangible. And sometimes it isn't tangible. It's not a tangible impact, but for example, well-being, your recommendations may enable somebody to be more confident, and you might not see tangible evidence of that greater level of confidence or greater clarity, but you can see that through the well-being, the person feels more confident, they feel clearer about something, or they feel that they have a broader perspective on something. And so with the scientific method, the dissemination of knowledge is really important. And that dissemination of knowledge can come about through reports that we write, books we write, conferences that we attend, or sharing our knowledge through social media. And as we all know, the influence and the impact of social media is immense in the contemporary world. So that's those blogs, those social media texts, whether it's a sentence on Twitter, the reason they are very influential and make a deep impact, very often it's because the person who's writing that is seen to be an expert in some subject or theme, and what they have to say really matters, and it's very valuable, and therefore it's shared. It can go viral because people consider it to be worth sharing. And so when we post on social media, we are self-publishing. So this is that third strand of my approach, the self-publishing, making what we have uncovered public, and that requires courage, because people may not agree with what we are sharing. They may not agree with it. They may criticize it. They may distort what we're saying. It does require courage, but that's, in my research approach, that self-publishing, that courage and that confidence, that creativity that we need in order to disseminate knowledge has to be an integral part of the research process. And why have I used this APS approach? Well, first of all, autoethnography is simply, it's based on our lived experience. And the reason I choose this as central to the way I do research is that it empowers those who are silenced in terms of cultural hegemony. In terms of cultural hegemony, there's the dominant culture and there's the culture which is overlooked. And so if we happen to be part of that culture which is not dominant, then autoethnography gives us the power to speak in situations where we may feel that our voice is not heard, we are silenced, we're marginalized, we're overlooked, or we're underrepresented. And so this is a way of speaking truth to power. So truth to power, it's when the community that is not as dominant has because power is not centralized, it's dispersed. And so through that dispersed power, the individual is able to stand their ground and be heard in that environment of cultural hegemony, where the dominant culture doesn't naturally provide the spaces for those from marginalized communities to be heard. So that's the reason that I use autoethnography as an approach which is appropriate and relevant for my own position in the community. Why do I use public engagement? Because public engagement means that we are researching with the community that we are writing with, as opposed to researching about a community or researching for a community. And with this approach, there's reciprocity. The researcher and the contributors are seen to be on an equal platform, on an equal ground. So the researcher is not the expert drawing or extracting or eliciting information from the participants and then going away with it. With public engagement, there is no going away. There's no kind of like exploitation of knowledge, and then, once that knowledge has been elicited, you don't see the participants again. With this public engagement approach, the contributors remain connected to the research because the research is something that they are also interested in, they're also curious about. So there's this co-creation of knowledge for the community, which can lead to emancipation of not only the researcher, but the whole community. And why do I use self-publishing? Well, self-publishing requires accountability, ownership, the agency, and the confidence and the courage to speak truth to power. And this is done by bypassing gatekeepers whose main interest is to protect the status quo. So when we are thinking about social justice, sometimes we need to bypass the gatekeepers and speak directly with our audience to benefit from the privilege of that direct communication where what we are saying is not distorted. In my view, I would rather speak to a handful of people in my own community that I am researching with, rather than have my message distorted to appeal to the masses. So even though my message may go much broader because I'm appealing to the masses, but I'm diluting what I'm saying. So my preference is to for there to be quality rather than quantity. And with this, as I said earlier, there does need to be the courage, because we don't have an agent who is there to defend our interests. We have to defend ourselves, and therefore, whatever it is that we are sharing, we need to take ownership of it, and we need to take the risks, the negative consequences potentially of people not liking what we have to say or criticizing it. And so that vulnerability, we need to defend our own vulnerability rather than relying on somebody else. And so I feel quite strongly that we need to be speaking the truth rather than distorting the truth, simply because the distortion appeals to more people. So in using a scientific approach to this APS research methodology, combining autoethnography, public engagement, and self-publishing, there are still those systematic steps that we need to take in order to demonstrate that we have followed an approach which is robust, which is reliable. So we start with ontology. Ontology is basically our perceptions about existence and the nature of reality. Epistemology is about knowledge. What is knowledge? Who decides what is knowledge? How do we know what we claim to know? Philosophy is about the underpinning ideologies, and that we form assumptions and beliefs about. And ethics is the principles of not doing any harm, intentionally or unintentionally. So being very reflective about the potential for harm, especially when autoethnography is sharing our lived experiences. Other people are involved in those lived experiences. And so even though we may have chosen to be public about our opinions, others who are related to us may not share that same approach. They may not want their involvement in our lives to be made public as such. We need to think about the research questions, make sure that the questions are clear, and that the methodology, how we're going to go about responding to those questions, is appropriate, it's relevant, that there's alignment. And the findings, we need to demonstrate very clearly how we've come to those findings, the conclusions. And self-publishing, as I said, needs to be with full awareness of what the potential risks are of the self-publishing, and eventually, in my view, emergence. The research is always iterative, because by the time we get to that stage of we've completed our analysis and our synthesis and drawn some conclusions, other questions will arise. And so there's that emergence of new exploration that needs to be carried out. So when we think about ontology, as I said earlier, the ontology is the nature of our being and our existence. Who are we? And this entails our identity. Who do we think we are? You know, do we identify as being British? Do we identify as being Sikhs, or do we identify as being based on our gender? Do we identify based on our profession? How do we identify? The language, you know, which is the predominant, the major language that we identify with? Are we multilingual? Are we bilingual? You know, which language is the strongest? And so that will form a part of our identity. The values that we hold dear. What values that are driving us? Is it truth? Is it justice? Is it prosperity? Is it entertainment? Humor, for example, could be a value. Joy, happiness. All of these are, creativity is a value. All of these are values that will steer us in a particular direction depending on what our priorities are. What beliefs do we have, and where do those beliefs come from? What ideology do we commit to? And what are the political assumptions? You know, do we believe in the rights of the individual or the rights of the collective? Do we believe that our primary concern should be looking after the vulnerable, or should the primary concern be making sure that there's economic growth? You know, so based on what we believe is more important, then our behavior will derive from that. What's the environment in which we are embedded, you know, and what's our position, what's our social position in that environment? What motivates us? What interests us? Why are we interested in focusing on this particular question? So when we are using autoethnography, the ontology, who we are, needs to be transparent. The people who are involved in collaborating in our research or reading our research, they need to know who we are, what our perspective is, why we have come to those conclusions. Because if their ontology is very different to ours, if their political assumptions are very different to ours, if the language they speak is very different to ours, then they may not see things, they may not come to those same conclusions as we have come to. And so they need to know why we think in a different way to them. So these similarities and the differences need to be laid out. This is where the transparency comes in. We can't pretend to be neutral, not in autoethnography. We're not neutral. If we are using our lived experience, we have to demonstrate our subjectivity. So epistemology, that is, what is knowledge and what do we know about? So whatever theme it is that we're interested in, we first of all need to think, well, what do we already know about this subject? And this is the difference between formal and informal research, because when it's informal research, as I said earlier, from childhood, we've been curious about things, and very often that curiosity, the answers that we are seeking are very easily provided by our family, who know more than we do, who are older than we are, or our teachers, or we can read and find out the answer in a textbook. But as we become adults, our questions become more particular, more specific, and it's when we can't find the answer to our question anywhere, that's when we need to dig more deeply. And that's when we may be interested in doing formal research on the subject, because we just cannot find the answer. And so, but we need to know where the gaps are in the knowledge. And it could just simply be, well, you don't know the answer because you haven't read up about it enough. So first of all, the first step would be to explore what knowledge is available about that. And then if still, even after you've explored all the knowledge that is available, you still can't answer that question, that's when you know we need to do a more kind of cultivated methodological research on that thing. So what don't we know about it? What do we know is important, and what don't we know? What is it that we don't know? And identifying that gap sometimes can take years, because it can take years to do that initial research to make sure the answer to your question, nobody has the answer. And it's when we get to that point of like, well, nobody knows the answer to this, then you know you've got a research subject that is worth committing your time and energy, because there's no point reinventing the wheel. If somebody has already written about something and your question was exactly what they were researching, and you find no reason to doubt their findings, their conclusions, if there's no reason to doubt what they've said, then you probably wouldn't think it was worth investing your time and energy in redoing that. So how do we know what we know? So we can be reading about that subject, and their perspective may be very different to ours. And so we need to know who they are, what their resources were, before we can decide on the credibility of what's been written. And likewise, when we're doing research, we need to be very transparent about our sources. How do we know? What sources are we going to be using? And who decides what's knowledge and what's not knowledge relating to that theme? And this is where the gatekeepers come in, because if, the gatekeepers, and they could be, expert judges, and we know that expert judges can make mistakes as well. And so if we can see some reasons to doubt that credibility, maybe that knowledge was credible 50 years ago, but it's not credible now because things have changed, then that can be another reason for doing research on something, when something is no longer up to date, no longer current, because values have changed and needs of people have changed. And so what makes the current knowledge credible, reliable, and valid? And this is an important question, because again, with gatekeepers, there can be cultural hegemony in terms of deciding what makes something credible, reliable, and valid. And for some gatekeepers, intuitive knowledge, it's not seen to be on an equal par as objective facts. Opinions and subjectivity may seem to be second class to objectivity. And so something which has got hard data, statistics behind it, may be easier to prove in terms of credibility, reliability, and validity, as opposed to somebody sincerely and articulately describing their experience, and that can be seen to be, well, that's only one person's experience. We can't generalize from one person's experience. And so we have to think about, are we looking at knowledge which we can generalize, or are we looking at knowledge which is subjective, which is particular, which is specific, but there's a depth in it rather than breadth. So a generalization is something which applies to a lot of people, whereas when we are looking at something which is more subjective, that the experience of those few people may provide us with a great deal of depth rather than breadth. And an example of this is the current crisis with the post office and the sub-postmasters. The lived experience of those sub-postmasters who suffered, their lived experience, we may not be able to generalize that lived experience to the thousands of others who didn't suffer the same fate as these 700 out of the thousands, but their lived experience gives us a deep insight rather than a broad brush, superficial thing of like, well, statistically, 95% didn't have a problem, but 5% did. But that 5% who did have a problem, they suffered in a very tragic way. So what makes the current knowledge credible, reliable, and valid? And so with my approach, it's about the depth rather than the breadth. It's not about making generalizations. So it's sharing knowledge which is based on relevant experiences, experiences which are relevant to the public, but we can't generalize, we can't stereotype using that knowledge. And our philosophy relates to the assumptions underpinning our deeply held convictions about the nature of being, our existence, and reality. And for myself, this is, we can look at hundreds of different philosophies, but for my own research, being who I am, I've basically looked at philosophies that have more of an Eastern approach and philosophies which have more of a Western approach. And the way I've kind of discerned or distinguished between what's an Eastern approach and a Western approach is that Eastern philosophies tend to focus on the whole, the collective, and we look at the needs, interests, and aspirations of the society rather than the individual. Whereas the Western philosophy, the focus is more on individual liberty, individual needs, individual interests, individual aspirations. And there's more of a fragmented approach where we are encouraged to focus on a particular theme in isolation, as though that theme, the fragment, is important. Whereas with the Eastern approach, we look at that the whole jigsaw puzzle, the whole picture, as opposed to focusing in on a particular part of that picture first. And in Eastern philosophy, there's very much of a focus on fate and destiny, that the physical realm is not the only realm. There are many domains to our lives, and there are power dynamics, not only at the physical level, but also the emotional, the spiritual level. Whereas with the Western approach, the focus tends to be on free will and self-determination and the mind. It's more about the cognitive and the mind, whereas the Eastern approach, there's more room for intuitive power, intuitive dynamics. And the Eastern philosophies tend to focus on sharing of knowledge in a public way, whereas the Western philosophy, it's about private ownership, it's about trademarking, copywriting, and not plagiarizing other people's work. So there's a very deep kind of significant focus on who owns that knowledge. Whereas in the Eastern approach, well, it's like that knowledge doesn't come from nowhere and everyone owns it. If it's knowledge, it needs to be public because it's derived from public fragments of information that we've basically just joined the dots in. So therefore, there's very much of a focus on transparency in the Eastern approach, I find, compared with the Western approach, where the focus is on privacy. We may hold on to our knowledge until we're ready to publish because it may be stolen. So whereas with the Eastern approach, we're more kind of encouraged to share the knowledge because it's through sharing that knowledge that the power is in the sharing rather than in holding it behind closed doors. In the Eastern approach, what I've noticed is that the focus is on the well-being of elders. So it's more kind of the locus of control is more on what's gone on before, the knowledge that has gone on before, and paying attention, acknowledging what's gone on before. Whereas in the Western approach, there tends to be a focus on the future. How will this knowledge benefit the future generations, the well-being of children? So even in families, the children tend to take the locus of control rather than the grandparents broadly. And in terms of the Eastern approach, I see it as being more systemic, more of a focus on interdependence, whereas the Western approach, there's more of a focus on independence. So the principle of ethics of doing no harm, in terms of research, we need to make sure that anyone who is contributing to our research is giving us consent, and that it's informed consent. They know why we're doing the research, they know who's funding the research, and what the risks and the benefits of the research will be. And the benefits of research should obviously outweigh the risks. And the research needs to advocate fairness and justice, because if the research will undermine fairness and justice, then there would be ethical concerns about is that a good use of time and effort to engage in research which doesn't advocate for fairness and justice. There needs to be the privacy and confidentiality of participants, transparency in the research, there's no deception, and we need to comply with the laws and regulations in terms of GDPR, make sure that if we are using email addresses, phone numbers of people who contribute, then that data is protected. The way I get around this aspect of compliance is I try to avoid taking anyone's email address. I only collaborate with people who are already on social media, so I don't need their private information, and so I don't need to have my own software to make sure that there's GDPR protection, because I don't keep personal data. I don't ask for phone numbers, I don't ask for email addresses. And to make sure that the participants have a right to withdraw their consent at any time, so they may have contributed through their discussions. And the way I avoid this is I anonymize. I make sure that people are not named in the research, and nothing is published that could be attributed to a particular person. And so if everything is anonymous, then that concern about withdrawing from the research doesn't really have a significant impact on the outcomes. And obviously they need to, if they are withdrawing, they would need to be doing that before your report was published. And so the way I overcome that is I share information, anything that I'm going to be writing about, I share that before it's published, if it's related to anyone concerned. But usually I don't use quotes verbatim at all. I will listen, engage in discourse, and then I form my own ideas and opinions about it. I connect dots with what other people have said, and so therefore nothing is directly revealing the identity of anyone who may have shared something, and that later on they think, oh, I'm not too sure I wanted to share that, but the way it's written about, it wouldn't be possible to identify who gave that information. And so when we have considered all the ethical concerns related to our questions, then this is a good way of thinking about what the research questions should be. Normally they are open questions beginning with either who, what, when, which, where, why, and how. And the clearer the question, the more succinct the question, the better I find. Now let's move on to public engagement. And so, as I said earlier, in public engagement, the researcher is not the expert. The researcher co-creates the knowledge with the public rather than about or for the public. And usually the research and the contributors share values. For example, when I'm collaborating with people in public engagement, that shared value of social justice and a desire to co-create social and cultural capital needs to be there, because otherwise we don't really have very much to discuss unless there is that shared interest, that desire to be co-creating, to be raising awareness of issues that are pertinent to our lives. And there needs to be this shared concern about citizenship. What can we do to contribute to our community? And how can this be a form of activism for social justice? And how can we inspire learning and increasing creativity through our work. And when we talk about public engagement, we need to be very, very clear about who our public is, because who we choose to be our public is a political choice. We can choose our public based on their identity. Are we going to be working with people who are familiar or people who are unfamiliar? In my own work, I tend not to collaborate with friends because they're too familiar, and not total strangers because I need them to be connected with me on social media. So there's a kind of familiarity. We belong to the same social media platform. So there's a level of familiarity, but it's not over familiar as in they are friends, and the research may kind of distort some of the dynamics if we are, we find ourselves talking about the same thing all the time. It can lead to burnout. And so I try to kind of keep my friends separate to the people that I'm engaged in discussions with, so that we know that there's a time and place to be discussing something which I'm researching, and there's a time and place to be talking with friends about nothing to do with research whatsoever, and not blurring those boundaries. And which language, I'm bilingual, Punjabi and English, but my research is in English because my Punjabi is not strong enough. And so that's a political choice. Why am I excluding those people who don't speak English as their first language? And I have to be very clear about why I have decided on that border, that kind of distinction between, well, is the first language English or is it not English? Because if it's not English, yes, I'm limited in that. But then what is it that I'm excluding? What is it that I'm not exploring? And as long as that is explicit in my research, then it's not problematic, because you've identified what the limitations are. In terms of education, I could choose to work with people who are highly literate or people who are illiterate. And of course, regarding which, based on that distinction, the discourse will be very different. I will get very different perspectives from people who their vocation has been farming, their whole life, as opposed to those who've been professionals their whole lives. The ideas that I get, or the values and the beliefs will be very different. And the location, when I'm doing research, I have to be clear, am I doing local based, am I going to speak with people who are local to me that I can speak to face to face, or am I going to work with people who are living in very different countries around the world, which means I will not see them face to face, but it will be virtual meetings. And so that's also a political choice, because I'm going to get a very different kind of public if I'm making those choices, that all of my research is going to be in a virtual platform, never face to face. So these are the choices that we need to make about who is our public and what is our sphere of influence in the public. If I choose to do research on the Sikh community, what's my sphere of influence? Am I on the margins of that community, or am I central to it? How strong are my relationships in that community? And why am I working with the Sikh community and not the academic community? I could choose to work with Sikh academics, and that would be a smaller community, and rather than like a broad brush community of Sikhs around the world. But again, I may make that choice for a particular theme or interest that I want to be exploring. So there needs to be an alignment between what it is that we're interested in researching and who we choose to be our public. And that who is our public is the same as when we are marketing in business. We have to decide who is our audience, who will our customers be, who is it that we are serving. And if we create a product that we think, well, this will serve everyone, it's usually not a high quality product. The more quality the product is, the more niche the audience is. it's the same with the public. It's like based on the theme that we want to explore, our public may become smaller and smaller and smaller because it's more and more specialized. And we have made a political choice about choosing the boundaries around who we engage as the public. And in public engagement, there needs to be multi-directional communication between the researcher and the stakeholders. Traditionally, the researcher will do the research and then they will speak at a conference and say what they found, but that's only a one-way communication. The researcher tells, but they don't listen, they don't adapt what they are saying, they don't use the feedback from the stakeholders to develop their research. When we're using public engagement, it's an iterative process where we speak, we listen, we draw some conclusions, then we share those conclusions again and allow the stakeholders, the contributors, to share their opinions about that, and then it becomes a co-created process rather than simply unilateral, where the researcher independently draws the conclusions and then basically says what those conclusions are and doesn't involve the contributors more than that. And there are risks of using public engagement. It's not always co-creative. It's very time consuming. And because it's so time consuming, a lot of that time can be wasted time, and it can distract us from other priorities in terms of the research. So in order to get a handful of people to be involved in your research, we have to contact, sometimes we have to contact hundreds of people to get a handful of people who are interested, because we don't really know who is likely to be interested. And so a lot of that can be seen to be wasted time. And if we send generic messages to the masses in our public, that can annoy our contacts. And people don't like to receive generic messages because they don't see how you're trying to save time, because you have to contact hundreds of people because you don't know who's going to be interested. And there's a lack of control over where your research will end up because of this iterative process, because you're sharing, you're being transparent. That research may have negative consequences, and those negative consequences may arise anywhere along the journey. That's one of the vulnerabilities that we have to make sure that we are resilient enough to handle if it arises. And our ideas may be distorted, our ideas may be misused, misappropriated to support counter-narratives. With this open sharing, we don't know how our ideas will be used, because we may have a fair idea how our public will perceive those ideas, but we don't know how those ideas will be received by those who are not part of our public, who are strangers, who may have very different values and very different agendas that they want to have narratives for. So the ownership and the copyright may be contested when the knowledge has been co-created through conversations, through discussions, through conferences. Very often during a conversation, a very interesting insight will arise and the conversation will continue. And then that idea can be developed later, but the original idea may have been, sometimes you don't know who actually raised that initial idea and who developed it. So there can be conflict around, well, who owns that? And I suppose the way I overcome this issue is by making sure that I synthesize any ideas, that there is a synthesis rather than simply quoting, one idea. It has to be developed. It has to be, there needs to be some sort of evolution of the idea for it to be included. And there can be unpredictable competitive initiatives, and some people are interested in commercial profit, and others are interested in public value of the research. And so that can lead to competitive initiatives. It can lead to loss of reputation and loss of self-confidence if what we are saying is not received well. So we do need to make sure that we have the confidence and the courage and the resilience to handle the negative critique, the negative feedback, because in some cases that negative feedback can lead to loss of jobs, loss of careers, loss of friendships. So that goes back to the ethics again, because when we are thinking about do no harm, it's do no harm to others, but making sure that we are not positioning ourselves to be damaged, in terms of our careers and our friendships and our jobs. We need to be protective of ourselves as well. So that do no harm has to be to oneself in addition to do no harm to others. So then we need to think about our data collection. What are the sources that we're going to use? Where are we going to collect the data from? So with the three different strands, autoethnography, public engagement, and the published work, with autoethnography, we could use our journals, our diaries, we could use photographs, videos, books that we've written before, articles, letters, emails. There's a vast range of both visual, multimedia sources of data from our own lived experiences. But we can't just simply write things down without being transparent about where we have got that information from. So there needs to be some sort of like a time parameter. For example, when I wrote Learn to Lead, I made it very clear that I'm writing about my learning journey, which spans around 60 years. And so with that, I included photographs from when I was a 6-year-old, and I included photographs from when I graduated with my PhD, and just seeing the juxtapositioning of the photographs, that also tells a story. There are connections to be made around that. I could have included information from videos that I've made previously. I did make reference to books and articles that I've written. I could have used letters, emails. So there's a whole array of things that we can use as data for our autoethnography. And in terms of public engagement, I've always used conversations, discussions, stories that people tell. I've used collaborations to co-create the narratives, spoken at conferences, organised conferences, coordinated conferences. And some of the public engagement has simply been through immersion in environments, observations, my experiences in a variety of situations. And the published work, this is the third person work where we look at the experts, the consultants, the authorities, what has already been written about this, who are the authors or the writers or the bloggers who've been writing about this subject. And, in some cases, we might look at historical archives, documents that we've seen in social media. So again, like there's a whole range of sources of data that we can collect for this type of research. Once we've collected the data, what do we do with it? Well, we can look for themes in that data. What are the themes? What are the patterns that we can see? What's the discourse? What's being said about it? What is the underlying meaning in what is being said about this? And what are the narratives, the stories that are being told? What is the underlying meaning, the agenda under these narratives? What is the message that those who are telling these narratives or creating these narratives, what is the agenda that they're trying to push, to communicate? What are the gaps in the data? And what's the value of it? What's the novelty? What's new? What insights have arisen as a result of you analysing that data? And has it led to creation of concepts, frameworks, models. So the reason that self-publishing is really important, where I'm concerned, is that it's a way of creating a communicative action which can be used to influence and to impact others by being articulate, honest, sincere. And this being articulate, honest, and sincere, I take from Habermas, the philosopher, where he talks about the power of communication in creating change. And I believe that we have to be courageous, we need to be confident and compassionate and creative to make sure that our communicative action is not harming others. It's used as a defense rather than an attack, that it's used to empower and create emancipation, where there's accountability, responsibility, the ownership of the content and the consequences, the freedom to bypass gatekeepers, to speak truth to power. And I think it's really important to note that when we self-publish, regardless of whether it's a sentence on Twitter or a sentence in social media, or simply recycling something that somebody has written, sharing it, that the existence of that kind of document exerts power. The fact that you have written something, there is power in that written word. There is power in publishing a video. There is power in sharing. There's power in liking. You know, the fact that you have liked a message, that very, you know, just pressing one button and liking, you've created a sign which signifies something. It contains meaning, and that meaning that conveys the fact that you've liked or disliked something, the meaning of that can be used powerfully. And so we need to take responsibility. We need to be accountable. We need to make sure that we are not allowing ourselves to be vulnerable through irresponsibility, that everything that we are doing when we are publishing, you know, as I say, at the bare minimum, we're publishing when we are liking something. We've published our perception. We have published our whether we stand on this side or that side. If I like something that somebody has said pro-Gaza, through liking that pro-Gaza, pro-Palestine message, I have published my my position in relation to that. So the existence of any kind of documentation like that does exert power, and this is the reason that for me, research that is self-published, as opposed to research which is published through the the lens of a gatekeeper who says, yes, this can go into this journal or it can't. It can have a very different quality to it, because we know who we often don't know who the gatekeepers are when there is an agent involved. We don't know their ontology. We don't know their perceptions about epistemology. Whereas, you know, when I have researched and I've said, this is who I am, this is what I believe is knowledge, this is how I have co-created this knowledge, and I am responsible for this, and to take that responsibility demonstrates courage and demonstrates confidence. And I believe that to be an essential pillar in doing research of this kind, you know, this kind of lived research which is based on our lived experiences. So that is broadly the my approach to APS, auto-ethnography, public engagement, and self-publishing. And as I said earlier, I've used the example of the book that I wrote based on this approach, Learn to Lead. And I'm currently writing a sequel to this about Azadi, Izzat, and the concept of Gar in the Sikh community in the diaspora. based in Canada, USA, the UK, New Zealand, and Australia. And so what is it that we think about those concepts of azadi and izzat and gar? And so I'm engaged in public engagement work, creating discourses around that, creating conversations, creating stories around that. And so if you have any questions, then please contact me through social media and let me know. Thank you.